I'll go to Chicago. So that's here. No, I'm retired. Totally retired. Totally I'm totally retired. Right now, I don't know, but I'm spending time here in Claremont. So, what I'm doing right now, what I'm doing right now.
Don't move. This is
I want to check with Pat about the first schedule, the coming December. We are taking her again. I just want to make sure she feels comfortable our last trip. Because down there, most people focus on down, even ignore her. I just want to how do you feel? She feels good too.
Oh, absolutely.
She likes to be served. Quiet.
No, it's just a pleasure. It's a pleasure to support.
I can't. But I have been 2 years.
Yeah, in a minute. I just want to double check our.
And also the come back our kindergarten every day to talk about her. Because but how to do it? Nobody knows. Even not how to do it. Right. So it has a certain appearance. So the way she the whole interact with the children inspired there.
That thrills me to know that
There's one had a skip the ball half time.
you want to put your book up here. Yeah.
Apparently all of them.
That worked out just beautifully last time. I got to.
What do you say?
And then,
For anyone who wants to sing, we're going to be singing number 6 in the songbook. Come sing a song with me. Come sing a song with me. Come sing a song with me. Come sing a song with me, that I might know you're mine. And I'll bring you home when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song that I might know you're mine, and I'll bring you home when home is hard to find, and I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the winter time.
Yay.
Are we ready to get started, Andrew?
We're still waiting for our presenter. We've got a couple minutes.
Okay. Want to do another song, Bonnie?
Oh, wait. Here we go. Here.
Hello, I'm Sherry Kling. I'll be your moderator this afternoon. So I guess I think what I'll do is introduce both of our speakers for this next session. And then, Philip, will you want to come up here for the first part, or?
It's be a fading flower in the corner.
Fading flower in the corner. All right, so the two authors we have speaking in this first session are Tim Eastman and Philip Clayton. Tim's essay is called Positive Solutions from a Plasma Physicist. And he has more than 35 years of experience in research and consulting on plasma science and applications, space plasma physics, space weather, magnetospheric physics, environmental and basic energy sciences, public outreach and education, and philosophy. Dr. Eastman developed key foundations at NASA headquarters and the National Science Foundation for major international and interagency projects. In 2009, he received the Creative Advance Award from the International Process Network for leadership in that scholarly community, and multiple publications focused on process thought and natural science. Our second author is Philip Clayton, whose essay is entitled Go Thou and Do Likewise. Philip Clayton is a philosopher and theologian specializing in the range of issues that arise at the intersection between science and religion. Over the last several decades, he has published and lectured extensively on all branches of this debate, including the history of modern philosophy, philosophy of science, comparative religions, and constructive theology. He is president of the Institute for Postmodern Development of China, and his book on organic Marxism is considered a serious option there. At the Seizing an Alternative conference, he chaired the section on science and organized a track on Whitehead and Marx. I will add that he is also my advisor.
Hence the nice introduction.
So if we have Tim on the line, we don't see him yet.
We're having some technical difficulties at the moment.
Should we switch order?
That's actually not a bad idea.
Let's go ahead.
Okay.
And that way I don't have to worry about Tim criticizing whenever. I'm safe. I was really worried about that.
Please welcome Philip Clayton.
Thanks. John's a strict timekeeper, so I'll need to be very careful. Laudato Si, paragraph 52. We need to strengthen the conviction that we are one single human family. There are no frontiers or barriers, political or social, behind which we can hide. Still less is there room for the globalization of indifference. These situations have caused Sister Earth, along with all the abandoned of our world, to cry out, pleading that we take another course. Friends, it's an age when many people feel powerless as the immensity of the environmental crisis sinks in. Melting ice caps, disappearing water tables, polluted rivers, the rising carbon levels that no one seems able to cap. I should say there was a Nature article 5 days ago about the melting of Antarctic, the West Antarctic, which now predicts, if that continues, a rise of 5 to 6 feet by 2010. 2000, yeah. Oh, there's Tim. We can't hear him yet. Should I keep going, Andrew, or should we stop and problem solve Tim? I've been trying to problem solve Tim for 15 years. There. Okay, he's hearing. That proves it. So, Tim, since we can't hear you, I'm going to go ahead and finish this talk, okay? Give me a thumbs up if it's okay. Okay. All right. In this age, the sense of powerlessness has continued to grow. If the species as a whole cannot stem the deadly tide of consumption, what can any single person do? What can I do? Is it even worth trying? So, key theme, hopelessness. Given the data, what can we do? How can we make a difference? Isn't it too late? Isn't the disaster even now sweeping over us and sweeping us away? I believe that Laudato Si brings hope. It gives hope. So the question is why? Why? What can we learn from it? And in my remaining 3.5 minutes, if John Quarren gives it to me, I would like to make 3 suggestions of why and in what way Laudato Si brings hope. Number 1, the organic relation. The organic relation. Not just because I just published a book with the word organic in it. Remember the source for the encyclical's title. St. Francis of Assisi wrote a religious song, a canticle in 1224 called the Canticle of the Sun, also known as the Canticle of the Creatures or Laudes Creaturum, praise of the creatures. This honors animals as brothers and sisters to humankind. Just an excerpt from the text from St. Francis. Be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures, especially through my Lord, brother sun. Be praised, my Lord, through brothers wind and air, and clouds and storms and all the weather. Obviously, I'm skipping passages, right? Be praised, my Lord, through sister water. She's very useful and humble and precious and pure. Be praised, my Lord, through brother fire, through whom you brighten the night. Be praised, my Lord, through all those who forgive for love of you. And finally, be praised, my Lord, through our sister, bodily death, from whose embrace no living person can escape. There's ground for hope in that because of this organic perspective. This is what environmental science actually offers to us, an understanding of our interconnection with each other, with all other species, with our ecosystems, and with the entire range of biodiversity on the planet. The Gaia hypothesis may not be established science, but it's a roadmap for where science needs to go. And the evidence, I believe, is pointing in that direction. Number 2, integral ecology gives us hope. Integral ecology, you know the phrase is in Laudato Si. As Teilhard de Chardin writes, the age of nations is past. Can I hear an amen to that? The age of nations is past. The task before us now, if we would not perish, is to build the earth. Amen?
Amen.
So the summary from Huffington Post, for example, of this phrase, integral ecology revisions the relationship between the human being and the natural world. It recognizes the human as integral to nature, rather than nature as subject to human dominion. Or in the words of Father Thomas Berry, this change is the change from an exploitive anthropocentrism, listen, to a participative biocentrism. Nobody could say it more concisely than Thomas Berry. The change requires something beyond environmentalism, which remains anthropocentric while trying to limit the deleterious effects of the human presence on the environment. Biocentrism goes beyond environmentalism. I think the closest we find is ecofeminism, which reimagines a relationship to the world. And finally, Naomi Klein describes integral ecology as the follows, quote, in many pagan societies, the earth was seen as a mother a fertile giver of life. Nature, the soil, forest, and sea, was endowed with divinity, and mortals were subordinate to it. That's the touch of integral ecology that is the second reason for hope. And finally, number 3, no one left behind. No one left behind. Not just no child left behind, as Washington tells us, but no one. Remember that Laudato Si was written to every person on the planet, to the whole human family. And please remember the canticle that closes the encyclical and these key words. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it. That we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Friends, what this offers is universal altruism. What our biology gives us by itself is limited altruism, a sort of reciprocal caring for others based on what they do or could do for us. Universal altruism says there's no limit. Every living thing is our family. That gives me hope, because that's an understanding of our very existence different than what we've had before. And let me close finally with another beautiful moment in that closing canticle from Pope Francis, quote, "Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey toward your infinite light." Thank you very much.
Tim, would you like to respond now? Can we hear you?
Oh, he just muted it.
Oh,
Can you hear me now?
there you go. Unmute.
All right, I'm all set?
You're set. There we are.
Thank you. Well, I really enjoyed Phil's comments and his wonderful writings I follow closely. And here now with these notes on integral ecology calls attention to the sort of more inclusive perspective, the way in which we need to strive for going beyond that kind of self-interest of a very local scale to being ever more inclusive to the human family, to the earth as a system. I got exposed when I first came here to Washington, D.C. in the late 80s to NASA headquarters, seeing some of the new developments in Earth system science that were with getting the Earth observing system started and so forth, and trying in implementing in those efforts recognition of the Earth as a whole system. And similarly, we need to take that kind of scientific perspective of Earth as a whole system and get people involved in sensing that in terms of how they operate. And so I think one thing, my comments will come to concern timescales. Unfortunately, our political system tends to be so oriented to short timescales that they don't attend to the long time scale issues that they have responsibility for. And I like to think in terms of the small company I'm part of supporting NASA Goddard, that our company has responsibilities for actions and implementation of needs for the Space Science Data Center, for example, on a timescale of a few days to weeks to months to at most our 5-year contract. But we have responsibility for that timescale, and we carry that out. So in the market system, there's competition for us to do better and better with respect to meeting those responsibilities for that time scale. But then for state governmental systems, they have a longer time scale and responsibility. Their time scale of responsibility is decade scale on the high end. And so it becomes more difficult for people to put their arms around the responsibility for those kinds of time scales. And I think it becomes especially a problem at the national level, where so much of the discussion of the policy is on short time scale, and they can't handle the long time scale. So Phil, we want to comment on this, my contrast of timescale, short-term versus long-term. How do we get people to put their arms around the long timescale?
I think that's interesting, Tim, and I can see three senses in which differences of timescale matter. The first one is climate change or climate disruption versus ecological civilization. Climate disruption, as a scientist said to me recently, has to be solved within 9 years, single-digit years, or the consequences are unbelievable. I could talk about the science. Whereas the move toward ecological civilization will take generations. We often get so blinded and frightened by the urgency of the climate change that we lose perspective on that longer term goal, which I think is what John's conference and the two organizations, Pando Populus and Toward Ecological Civilization, see. Tim, the timescale you bring out so nicely in your chapter in the book is a timescale between the problems of ecological disruption and the terms of political leaders. Because they're inclined to give answers in terms of how long they're in power, whereas the issues are longer term. And the last one, Tim, is the aging of individuals. When we're young, we just begin to see it. When we get more gray hair, we realize it's important to live for those beyond ourselves. So if we can allow the youth who have that idealism to lead us, and the old ones with the gray hair who have wisdom, it's kind of those men in the middle who worry me.
Very well put, Phil. That's excellent response to my question about timescale in your view. I have nothing further to add to it right now.
Okay, thank you, Tim. So we have about 17 minutes left for questions. Of anyone would like to ask a question of Philip? Yes. Yes, right there.
Oh, I think your ideals, it's been a long time since I've studied philosophy, so bear with me here. But, I love what you say. I love what Obama said.
Well, thank you for that comparison.
You like it or not. And my son is I love my son. He's a fine man. He works hard. He has raised some lovely children. That guy is going to vote for Donald Trump. Oh. Now, I'll tell you what, I respect him, but I never respect his political opinion. I do. He's a conservative Republican. How are the two of us ever going to get together on these subjects? He's adamant. I'm adamant. I don't understand. I mean, what is the solution here? Our reptilian nature, how are we going to change that? I don't like the way you look at me. In my own family, there are people, we are very distant, we are very close, but don't say the wrong thing. I just had a visit from my son from Texas. Be careful, don't say the wrong thing. I respect what your ideals, but my God, how do you do it?
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate, I have to stand up if that's okay with the guy on the camera. You'll never keep up with me. I'm going to be running back and forth, Andrew. I appreciate the realism of what you said, and I want to multiply it by 4 and then ask people to think about these grounds for hope. So I actually think the grounds against hope are massive. First, reptilian brain is right. We have evolved for a brain that responds to danger, and it responds with fear and violence. And the violence is correlated with testosterone, and half the species has way too much of it. And that will always, until we change the brain and hormone system, raise problems. For example, in the amygdala, which is the fear center, there are a massive number of neurons running to the prefrontal cortex, which means that the decision center is aware of fear and will respond to it. It's the white knuckle phenomenon. The number of neurons running from the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala to say, don't worry, it's going to be okay. are virtually none. So that means our biology builds in something harsher. Then in the history of evolution, number 2, when we found danger, our instinct is to move to an in-group as opposed to an out-group. And you see that in society, you see it with governments, you see it in churches. I had the chance to speak to the quadrennial at United Methodist in Nashville, and I said, have no fear and resist the temptation to build walls to protect United Methodists from evil groups like Presbyterians, Anglicans and Catholics. So we have this tendency, the one seminary is under attack, it builds its walls and attacks the other one. So this is universal among humans, or family even. The third one is what happens in society and politics. You put those first 2 elements together, our brains and our biological tendencies, and you apply that to politics, and you get Donald Trump. And then you get otherwise rational people whom you want to love siding with this sort of an approach. And lastly is religion. And for me, the most, may I say, demonic of all, is that religion gets enlisted in that evil trinity of factors and becomes sometimes the most dangerous of all. Because religion then justifies in the name of God the worst of our biology, namely the 3 factors that I described. So against that backdrop, which is realistic, we quest for grounds for hope. And if we don't take on the negative grounds, what Christians traditionally call sin, then we will not find realistic hope. And it will be a pipe dream. It will be utopian.
Can I just add one more thing? I've been in situations where, a person has stage 4 cancer that doesn't have, a chance, a very small chance of you surviving 2 months. And yet people come and they say, well, trust in, they give them supposedly hope. But what about realism? I mean, how, it's sort of like, I hate all this positivity, in the world, when it's just bullshit. And
Would you say that more explicitly, please?
but I mean,
We wanna know what you really
think. Be positive.
Okay.
You'll change your life.
Thanks. So let me call in the next speaker, but thanks very much. I endorse your realism, but as a professor, I'm not allowed to use your vocabulary.
Do we have another question here? John?
Yeah, Philip, Gaia may not be established science. I know originally Margulis and Lovelock were trashed, but I thought what Tim called system science had come to embrace at least some element of Gaia, maybe not under the label Gaia. What I've heard most recently is that there's a big Princeton book that says probably Gaia isn't strong enough to withstand the human impact. So I mean, it's that makes the Gaia hypothesis questionable. So I'm asking a scientific question, and
I understand.
I'm prepared to learn the truth.
Yeah, so that's a great comment. I didn't know about that book, and that's discouraging because for Lovelock, and really, I call you Triple R, Rosemary would describe a Gaia who will survive no matter what we do. To hear the scientists say we're not sure that she will survive. Here's why I think that the science isn't enough. The things we can say from systems theory or ecological theory about Gaia are minimal, as is much scientific language. So systems are interconnected. There's some sense in which they permeate to the planet as a whole. And I mean, I could, if you want, I'll do 3 or 4 other summaries of the scientific data. But what we need is a rich, robust, throbbing, teleological, values-based Gaia, which is what Rosemary has been writing about since at least 1992. We need the goddess. We need, in that same way in which a god or goddess pulls us, guides us, and takes our highest values and embodies them, if I may, at a much higher level. We need an embodied set of values which is the earth, which is inseparable from the earth, because the dualistic male god is just too much of a temptation. So something that takes our sense of divinity and ties her completely to our planet and to the only, as Carl Sagan says in that famous pale blue dot, you can find it on the web, he says it's the only planet that we can inhabit. Maybe someday there's a chance to colonize another planet, but not now. It's not in the cards. The only home we have, he says, so movingly in the pale blue dot. And we need to understand her as sacred. So the science won't ever give us that, John. It will maybe give us an increasing sense of the interdependence of all living things. But we need the goddess. And I think that's what Rosemary has communicated so powerfully 24 years ago.
Yes.
Your grounds for hopelessness are so concrete and biological. The reptilian brain, the in-group, the safety and groups and so on. And then mixed with the grounds for hopefulness, which seems so much more abstract. Why is it that we evolved to destroy ourselves? Maybe that's what I'm asking you. I mean, how do you?
Okay. My friend David is in the audience, and he, as a physicist, develops, picture two lines. The line of all we can know physically or biologically, and that's the discouraging part. And then he has a vertical axis, the spiritual axis. But it also has its laws, its interconnection, its karma, if you will. And the scientific results are concrete because that's what science does best. The spiritual laws are more vague and harder to understand, but they're just as compelling and just as powerful. In fact, I want to say one other thing. Biological change is very slow, right? We are the product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. In fact, really, we have to go back 2 million years ago to begin understanding who we are. Actually, the mammals were there when the dinosaurs died 165 million years ago, so actually it's a much longer time scale, or go back to the Cambrian Revolution. But technically, we need 2 million years to explain us. And biological change is, by and large, much slower. There are exceptions. Spiritual changes, it can be instantaneous. I mean, look at what happens when you have a pope who speaks for the true values, the deeper values of Jesus and the Jesus movement, and you have a worldwide influence in a year. Spiritual change is very, very rapid. So as much as it may not seem as empirical, you shouldn't be surprised. And you can say, but if we all get together and decide, we can stop this thing. Not without death and pain, but the humanity can achieve an ecological civilization if we all choose to do it. Is that more hopeful?
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, Mary.
In your article, you said that the ecological crisis is a moral issue. And as we know, churches or religions always have a function to improve people's virtue. And you also said that popes in cyclical is urgent because it's a call to action. So I was wondering, Pope gave us his intellectual in cyclical just last year. So I was wondering, either before religion or church didn't realize climate issues. I know I can't think.
No, that's good. That's an excellent question. I'm very pleased that that's my closing question, as Ms. Kling will say in a moment, soon to be Dr. Kling. And so it lets me say what I most want to say at the conclusion. Ideally, religious groups would lead. Almost every religious group calls people to rise above their own interests for the good of the whole. Buddhist compassion meditation, the understanding of Tian in Confucian tradition, the understanding of Tao in Taoist tradition, the Christian call to compassion, the Jewish call to justice and compassion, the call of justice and mercy in Holy Quran, each of those. But religions aren't taking the leadership. You're right, it remains a moral issue, which means we turn to humanity as a whole and we beseech people to recognize that moral core in us, and through that moral core to rise up beyond selfishness. It's a moral issue because selfishness dominates the human species. When I first went to China, my friends like Jaha taught me, we live for the good of the whole group, and nobody lifts himself above the group. Now I go to China and the big billboard says, I enjoy, it's about me, go to the shopping center. And I thought 15 years ago, Jaha, I never would have seen that sign in China. And now I see it. That's about selfishness. The West has represented selfishness like no culture in this planet since humanity began. So that's why it's a moral call. In closing, maybe the religions will pick up humanity responding in a more, in a less selfish way, a more giving way, and the religions will follow. They're supposed to be leaders. They're not leading by and large. Thanks, you guys. Thanks very much.
We've got just a couple more minutes. I'd like to ask Tim if he might offer a thought on a question I'd like to ask related to Philip's essay. So as we've been talking about in this last section, you write that this need for a broader perspective takes us to metaphysics, and that without some instance of value that transcends the interests and desires of human agents in the here and now, all too many will adopt the take what you can attitude. By contrast, life lived before a higher value calls actors to self-limitation, which we just discussed. Tim, I'm wondering if you could comment on, if there is a higher value, and we call it biocentrism, how can scientists support an effort of this call to a more moral, higher value of love and care for the earth? How can scientists be part of that, recognizing that need for a higher value that transcends self-interest?
So, and now can you hear me all right there?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay. One thing that I was, I think scientists, they focus on their own expertise, their own training, their own focus. For those aspects that go to issues of values and meaning and so forth, that's something that it goes beyond their initial training, but they are moral beings, just like we're just like anyone else. I think, and I think that's true of any other, so to speak, specialty. And if anything, we have enhanced responsibility because of the possibility that scientists can contribute in some helpful way to these solutions. In that sense, we have enhanced responsibility. Phil, I enjoyed his comments about the notion of value, and certainly in the philosophical literature, there was a debate about the facts-value distinction over the last century, even to the point of, we have a radical separation of that, and of course that leads to an emphasis on facts and actualities and the realities, and somehow values are like epiphenomena. They're derivative, they're secondary. I think that it's just the reverse, that what really is important are the values and meaning. That's the fundamentals in which that gives us the purpose that we set goals and work towards them. So it's associated with that I think we need really much more investment and focus on supporting humanists and good scholarship, and those religious scholars that can help us reframe and see ourselves in different and new ways, and be self-aware in ways that attend to those values and meaning of life.
Thank you. So now we can switch and have Dr. Eastman give us a few minutes on his essay. I've already introduced you, Tim, but again, your essay is entitled Positive Solutions from a Plasma Physicist. And then Dr. Clayton will respond.
Well, thank you. I really have enjoyed participating with this whole program and being having the opportunity for a contribution to the volume, and it really helped. It sort of encourages me to focus in a new way on this issue of the the importance of humanistic study, and I'm just an enthusiast about that, and I think we've really gotten many things inverted. One is related to the issue of timescale that I mentioned, which, as Phil noted as well, about the way in which our biological being, or in our political framework, often in our business work, we're focused on short time scale, and whereas and indeed, for businesses such as the business I work in, supporting NASA Goddard, we're very efficient at addressing the needs of the time scale for which we have responsibility, up to 5 years in that case. But then you have a state organization, and its time scale is on the order of several decades, and they need to fulfill their responsibility, they need to address that, and that it gets even longer time scale at the national level. Unfortunately, the political leaders tend to be so caught up with the short time scale and reinforcing the interests of business that also are short time scale, that those responsibilities to the long term are undermined. Well, an example of that is, so to speak, the standard narrative about fossil fuels and petrochemicals and so forth. And it seems like the standard narrative, like it or not, for lack of alternatives, it's been claimed that fossil fuels and petrochemicals, the petro industry, has to be our prime focus for the coming century, because alternatives are at secondary at best, they're not ready, and so forth. Well, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. John Cobb's call, is it too late? If we had responded to that call in the last 45 years and did aggressive investment in alternatives, we would be so much further along now than where we are on a whole range of possibilities. And I even now, given that we haven't done that and only in a rather anemic way have addressed alternatives, even now there are real possibilities and opportunities to aggressively move forward if people would take on that responsibility. I would like to encourage some positive solutions-oriented responses to this. I've noted a few in my essay, in which to encourage more people to become more aware of the wide array of eco-friendly technologies that could be aggressively pursued, that go beyond the narrow scope of the fossil fuel and petrochemical industry. I like to think that the truly long-term energy sources are not the ones of the depletable fossil fuels and the relatively thin lithosphere of the Earth, but in a way are exemplified by the sun. The sun will be continuously propagating out energy for its life scale of a few billion more years. We're embedded in that. That's solar power. Then the Earth's power itself, the temperature difference between the surface and the center of the Earth could be tapped indefinitely. That's geothermal. Then the kinds of responses of the Earth system to its interaction with the atmosphere, wind power and so forth, those are going to be long-term available. So there's multiple ways we could tap into truly long-term sources. But so far, when you talk about alternatives, a lot of people tend just to talk about the fission alternatives. Well, fission fuels are only going to be available for a couple thousand years. Fossil fuels, not at most, maybe a couple hundred years, maybe coal for a couple thousand, but the timescales are all relatively short term. I think what we need to do is really focus on the long-term sources, and that's do either solar power, do it the way the sun does, which is fission, geothermal, wind power. There's a whole array of these. And then in combination, there are numerous efficiencies and conservation methods that could be used. For example, in transmission lines. Some 40% of the power on transmission lines is lost due to only loss, dissipation, just low-grade heat into the environment. Well, one could do more to maybe enhance, move towards superconducting transmission lines for major intercity grids to radically reduce that loss. Then waste handling and recycling. For example, I went and saw in Washington State a plasma-enhanced melter system that can completely take waste of any type and decompose it into its residual subsets without. It's not a combustible method. It's not. It's a non-combustion method, and this has the possibility long-term to be able to eliminate landfills if one really focused at implementing this. And infrastructure and maintenance. There are new methods for paint removal that can be so much more efficient and less toxic than current methods. And then embedded smart technologies are possible that could help monitor infrastructure and help enhance efficiencies. And of course, one of the great polluters of the world are all the military systems of the world. If we could somehow do more to reduce our military-based projections of power versus genuine defense and encourage others throughout the world to be in this mode. And insofar as we get involved in a military process, to be always involved with something that's truly international, not the U.S. versus whatever. Military operations are very polluting. We need to reduce that. And we just also in general need enhanced feedback for decision making to offset the disconnect between the short time scale of our typical business process and the long-term time scale of our genuine needs. So it's a combination of these. Overall, we need to think of what are the positive solutions to these things, and I have no doubt that scientists, technology people across the board will help out insofar as they're given, say, some clear questions and clear objectives and clear purposes in that. That's all.
Great, thank you, Tim. Bill?
Well, Tim, I was a little worried when they paired us together, and in the order of me following you, because you wrote about positive solutions from a plasma physicist, and I'm supposed to talk about go thou and do likewise, which means I'm encouraging the audience to all become plasma physicists. Not intended. Tim likes that. Is it plasma.org? What is your website?
Plasmas, plural. Plasmas. Plasmas.org.
Plasmas, I left out the S. Plasmas.org. The other thing I like about having a physicist with us is that he speaks of thousands and thousands of years of resource lasting, and then he says this is relatively short term. Right. So, Tim, you're writing about technoscience in your article, and you argue that it is not the opponent, which is not typical of what people in the environmental movement generally do. They assume that science and technology are the enemies automatically, and all business related to them, and that they're doing us in. So that makes your voice in this collection a particularly important voice, though you speak for a minority in this book. Science brings us knowledge of the world. Without the cause of climate change, global climate disruption, we won't be able to know whether we have a solution and what's worth the investment. Without science, we're blind. And Tim focuses on that. And then the technology that science produces. Technology can be used selfishly, but it can also be a key part of the response, as Tim's talk suggests. In fact, what's really interesting about your article and what you just said, Tim, is that you focus consistently on positive use, on values as primary, as you just said. So when I read your article, I realize you're not just a blind advocate of technoscience. It is really an ethical piece, moral piece, spiritual and religious question that you're describing in this text. And for you, Tim, also a philosophical question. Your work on Whitehead and physics goes back 25 years now, if I'm remembering correctly, at least. Yeah. So all of these are factors that depend on how we use science. It's not just science itself that's relevant. I loved your concrete suggestions in the chapter. You guys have to read his section on Windows. He'll tell you things about Windows you never even dreamed of. Technology, I can't summarize it without Tim jumping in, but there's technology in Windows that if we employed it, could make air conditioning in the United States unnecessary. And you know what kind of waste that is. And the other thing you should read about in Tim is focus fusion, which I presume is on plasmas.org. If we develop this, if we focus on R&D, we can produce energy for 10 cents a gallon. We can meet energy needs. So there is a development in science that can be helpful to us. Your feedback to leaders question, Tim, is extremely important. We need good R&D, but we need to get it to leaders, and we're failing to communicate clearly, which again is one of the goals of the Ecological Civilization program. I also love your focus on coordination between leaders around the world, in politics, in business, among heads of NGOs, and also among religious leaders. That's extremely important. So one question, Tim, and then I close. Could you generalize what you write here in this chapter? Could you speak of the positive use of all the tools that are available to human beings, not just technoscience? Would you be willing to generalize to everything that's in our hands and under our power? Because I felt that maybe that's where this chapter is really pointing. And finally, I conclude, as you concluded, with your focus in your very last sentence or so about integral ecology. And Tim says in closing, Laudato Si deals with the critical global problems of climate sustainability in a unified manner. It's in dialogue with integral ecology for an ecological vision. And Tim, that's what I appreciate most about what you've accomplished. Thanks very much.
Okay, we've got about 13 minutes for questions.
Or Tim's response, if you want to start with that.
Or, yes, I'm sorry. Tim, would you like to respond to?
In terms of your last, so to speak, query of is there some more inclusive framing of this that I could try to express in 20 words or less or whatever, I'm a little bit short of that capability right now, or perhaps anytime. But it's like we all need to work together. There's such a great resource of people in the sciences and the engineering fields and the humanities. We need to work together, and so then that calls for how is that coordination enabled? We need more of the kind of thing that the Center for Process Studies brings to bear to various levels of coordination groups nationwide and internationally. We need more of all that. But indeed, to me, that's much more important than some of the political discussion I hear that, to me, all too quickly gets into tit for tat versus anything, substantive things. So I tend to just ignore the political discussion, keep focusing on good scholarship, and then when I have to get back to the political thing, I'll examine the real issues carefully for the week before the election. Then I'll participate. I always vote. But it is distressing to see the political sphere so detached from the issues and also detached in the timescales, as we mentioned. That's all.
Thank you. Questions?
Bruce?
Yes.
One of the questions I have is like in I mean, maybe it's kind of a truism in management of technology that we're never able to successfully get the outcome of technical innovation. And just thinking about how that goes with timescale, on how we can envision the future. We might be living in large lives. Our forward motion through time ends up being in continual surprise.
Tim, that's a good question for your chapter, actually. Could you hear it?
Not quite all of it, but I gather, what about certain surprises, technological surprises or innovations that we don't anticipate? How might that impact our plans?
Just slightly different. Professor Hansen is saying that there seems to be an inherent unpredictability in the growth of science and the effects of technology. And that brings at least a worry and possibly a disaster about depending on making predictions about where technology might take us. Is that fair?
Oh, yes. Well, the question is well expressed in terms of future science or engineering developments certainly are very unpredictable, and both with respect to the developments themselves and the responses to them. So I don't know what to add to certainly. There's a lot of contingencies here, and yes, it's unpredictable. So what do? We do the best we can based upon what we currently know, and but I think what we currently know is certainly much more points to needs and possible solutions that go well beyond what you typically hear in the certainly in the normal political discussion, but even in what I hear in many standard meetings on whether it be energy sources or other things. That, for example, I read a review about energy sources and alternatives a few years ago that was I think in the New York Times, and it just discussed the standard sources and made brief reference to, say, increase efficiencies with gas and with solar power, but made no reference to other alternatives. But there's a wide range of other options out there and possibilities. And so the awareness of these things needs to be enhanced. And of course, there's the additional unknown factor of what really new things could come along. So I don't know.
John?
Tim, Phil alluded to this. Your chapter begins and ends by acknowledging the dark side of techno-science. The term that Laudato uses is technocratic paradigm. Could you say anything about, what should we say, the responsibility of scientists and engineers to prevent their disciplines from being dominated by ideological and economic or economistic factors? I mean, we appreciate the genuine light side opportunities for science and technology to help us out of this situation, but it seems that technology has been dominated by a kind of anthropocentric takeover of the planet. Trying to get you to say more about the dangers of technology.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly there's no shortage of examples of the dangers of technology. Nuclear weapons comes to mind pretty quickly in my mind. I worked at Los Alamos in the 1970s and actually did a few secret reports on nuclear weapons effects myself, which I can't read any longer given that I don't have the classification. So you work on that, you make that possible, and then political leaders may have a rather different idea about thresholds for implementation. That was Oppenheimer's great struggle in the 1950s via nuclear weapons. Well, that's maybe an unusual example, but in a way, the possibilities of new technologies have the positive and sometimes the negative side, and I think most of my science colleagues recognize the responsibility that comes with that. But it's a mixed bag, because you have, on the other hand, other people that say, go with the flow, do the usual thing, focus on the bottom line, what the profit margin is, and buy into the narrative of whatever the standard narrative is. I think in part, but through consciousness raising, you can get average folks like myself more involved with and grappling with these issues and attending to that responsibility to and the ethical dimension of this. And to recognize we don't have a separation of facts and values. Facts and values are interlinked, and values are fundamental, as Phil pointed out.
Tim, I might ask, as kind of related to that, we have such, you talk about the, that in some respects science sees itself as being context independent, but yet you acknowledge that everything is applied in some kind of context. If our context right now is one of strong vested interests in current technologies that are like, say, the petrochemical industry, or the vested interests in maintaining the military as it now is, and even just the fact that research follows the money, and the commercial interests will direct the research that is done, and therefore much research won't be done and won't be implemented. Is there any way that you can see that we can change our context so that more power is given to this push toward these newer things that are actually for the common good?
Well, that's a very good question, and I don't have any easy answer. Each one of us can become, contributors ourselves in some particular focused way. For example, I've gone to legislators on occasion on Capitol Hill and talked with people directly, but I typically have found that gets, doesn't get very far, but sometimes you can get lucky. And I've had people come to my house and discuss with them one-on-one about certain issues that I'm concerned about. And more often than not, that gets nowhere, but sometimes you get lucky. But I think persistence helps, and being part of a group, responsible, active group, forwarding the values you are part of, that can make a difference. And I guess even lobbying, so to speak, although I've never, lobbying is, for me, is such a mixed bag, because there's the abusive side of it. So I don't have any easy answer to that. I think there are ways that we could, suggest changes in our political system so as to encourage greater feedback and responsiveness and accountability. I think that would be helpful in many ways. We need more accountability in many of our systems.
Thank you. We've just got a few more minutes. If there's maybe one more question.
This is David.
Yes, my name is David Yu. Professor Clayton alluded just a minute ago about some ideas that I have about the existence of a spiritual axis that is orthogonal to the physical axis. And very similar to the idea that time is orthogonal to space in the old days when science first developed about 100 years ago. And I think if we actually truly recognize that the spiritual axis, the spiritual dimension, and the physical dimension actually form an integral system that describe our reality. I think if we truly realize that, some of the questions that are raised could be answered in that frame of reference. For example, I do a lot of technology work also, and apply for programs called the Small Business Innovation Research. and under that program, we get research, we get money for funding. And in the evaluation of those programs, there are 3 criteria. One is, what is the scientific merit? The second is, can you do the job? And number 3 is, what is the commercialization potential of what you're trying to do? Now, if we truly recognize that the spiritual axis and the physical axis is an integral system, we might add another dimension. What is the spiritual value of what you're doing? Now, a question like that has never been answered, for example, in our current system. And I think some of the questions that were raised about the technology, the direction we're going, in addition to asking the question whether it's scientifically, does it have scientific merit? Do you have the manpower? Do you have the capability to do it? Does this have commercialization potential? I think we should add another dimension. Is there a spiritual value to what you're doing?
Thanks.
Come from this actually answered
Yeah.
a question that Professor Clayton asked.
So let's see what Tim says. Could you hear that, Tim?
We've only got about 30 seconds.
Not entirely, but basically, in terms of the spiritual dimension, that's not my training. I read and appreciate that, but I would like to come back to what you had said, Phil, about the importance of values and meaning. And so all scientists and technologists, in terms of their application, are concerned about purposes, their goals, and so forth. They're concerned about values in their own way. I think one can make the case for that. But you don't need to explicitly use the spiritual word per se in that argument. Appeal to the importance of values and meaning and goals and purposes. You can do so much with that because we don't do technology applications for nothing. You do it for a purpose, and I think those need to be articulated well and effectively.
Okay, great. Let's give our presenters a hand. A changing of the guard and invite Mark Dibben and Vern Visick to the front table.
Bye, Tim.
While they're coming up, I will tell you a little bit about our 2 speakers.
You want to go first? Because I can speak first. Okay, you go first.
Are we going with the order where Mark is going to talk first and Vern will respond, or are we switching?
No, we're going to switch.
Okay. All right. So Mark Dibben is Dean of the School of Business and Economics at the University of Tasmania. His research focuses on applying process thought to management, issues of trust, organization, human relations, and leadership. He was executive director of the International Process Network from 2008 to 2011 and remains on the board. He serves on the editorial board of Process Studies and is also a co-editor of the journal Philosophy of Management. His book, A Process Philosophy of Management, is forthcoming from Process Century Press later this year. He organized the management track at the Seizing an Alternative Conference. And Vern Visick is an environmentalist, scholar, and ordained minister who remains active in retirement at Pilgrim Place. He did his graduate work in ethics at the University of Chicago Divinity School. He served as campus minister at the University of Wisconsin and was director of New College Madison, an experiment in prophetic ministry. He led the Agenda for a Prophetic Faith, highlighting the church's interest in ethical issues. In 1996, he received the Francis Asbury Award for Creativity in Campus Ministry Programming. He played a key role in planning and organizing the Seizing an Alternative Conference and chaired the section on society. Please welcome Vern Visick and Mark Dibben.
I'm going to stand because my voice is a little weak. I'm just overcoming a bout of the flu. And can you hear me in the back? Good. We're switching the order here because what I would really like to talk about is the university. And I'm not one of those who think that the university is the answer to everything, or is the total evil enterprise that some people seem to think it is. The university, in my opinion, is an ambiguous institution, and the mark of maturity as an ethicist is to be able to determine what's positive and constructive and what's destructive and negative. Determine the difference between those and enhance one and suppress the other. Now, on pages 72 to 75 in the Laudato Si piece, Pope Francis says a number of things that might be an answer to the problems we've just been talking about. Let me try them on with you to see what you think about it. He says about technology that what we need to do is transcend the controlling, domineering attitude towards reality that's implicit in our practice of technology in favor of a receptive and a contemplative attitude towards reality. Let me repeat that because it's very important. We need to transcend the domineering, controlling attitude that's behind our use of technology mostly, and transcend it in the direction of a receptive, contemplative attitude towards reality. If we were to do this, not only would we get a much more constructive practice of technology, less destructive and more constructive, but since science develops in tandem with technology, we get a different kind of science as well. Not science for profit, not science for power over lesser peoples and other people, different kinds of situations, but we get a science that would be characterized in a different sort of a way. Science for understanding, science for care, science for deepening our understanding and our appreciation for the wonder and the awe of the creation in which we've been placed. We'd ask different kinds of questions. Instead of what kind of knowledge is most useful in the business enterprise that universities are increasingly involved in, we'd ask questions like, what do we need to know to understand how the whole thing hangs together? Instead of asking the kinds of things that are technically useful, we'd ask questions like, what kind of knowledge do we need to care for the reality in which we've been placed? That's a very important issue, and a lot of the scientists that I know would say we need to understand what's going on. You can't care for something unless you know what is actually happening and what it's like and what its destiny is. So we get a different kind of science, and this would be a very important kind of an issue. Now, this is very important in three different kinds of ways, and I'll say this very quickly. In my career at the University of Wisconsin, I once was part of a large program where there were something like 70 to 75 biologists and physicists, and Dan McGuire was speaking to this group, and we were talking about the problems of science in a university like the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And McGuire said, parenthetically, you know, we can practice our science as a godly activity. And we can practice our science in such a way that there is meaning to everything that we do that has ultimate significance. I remember the energy that whipped through the crowd when he said this. Nobody in that crowd had ever thought about it that way before, but when he put it in that kind of a context, it added meaning to what they were doing in their scientific activities. In a university like the University of Wisconsin in Madison, there's quite a bit of concern about what's happening in the sciences. This was a group of biologists. And in the area of biology, there's quite a movement of money and resources and facilities to biotech kinds of issues and other kinds of uses of biology. And the sensitive people in this discipline are quite aware of what's happening. I remember David Ehrenfeld saying that he's quite distressed. He's the former editor of Conservation Biology, and saying that there's less and less money for taxonomy. There's less and less money for the history of biology. There's less and less money for the philosophy of biology. Everything is moving towards the kinds of things that can profit by the development of biological sciences. Very distressing. We need to, as ethicists, be able to support the people that are criticizing that movement in biology. There's another issue. If we were to develop an interest in science for understanding and science for care, this would provide an entirely new and meaningful mission for the research university. Hannah Arendt said that what goes on in the research university is the knowledge, more and more knowledge of less and less aspects of reality. But our ignorance of what's going on at the level of the whole is quite significant. And there are places where people in the research university are beginning to understand this, and they're taking on a whole new holistic mission to understand what's happening. One example is the Gun Institute at the University of Vermont and associated and related institutions in Canada. Take a look at that website if you want to see what a research program which focuses on the whole looks like, instead of the typical kinds of research programs that we know about. There's a last thing that I'll just say very quickly about seminary education, because seminary education is very far removed from the dynamics of what's going on in the research university. It's not totally true, because we have developed an interest in the helping professions and the psychological sciences at Kleinville, and also in the similar kind of institution at Fuller Seminary. But we are quite separated from the political and social and biological and physical realities of what's happening. And so there ought to be some way in which we could educate clergy and people working towards becoming clergy in seminaries, because we don't know how to speak to the actual dynamics of what's going on with the people in the pew in a place like Claremont or a place like Madison, Wisconsin. So there's a lot of work that has to be done in seminary education to make us relevant to this new kind of situation. That's enough to say, and we can, if it means anything to you, we can discuss what I just said.
Thank you. Vern? First, we'll ask Mark to respond.
You asked me to respond. I think, let me say a couple of things first about Vern. It's been an honor and a true privilege to know Vern now for just over a year. We worked very closely on the conference, and every single time I managed to have even 5 minutes with him, it's a joy and a blessing to learn from him. The challenge of research, I come from a research university, I come from a top 10 research university in Australia, and I worry that certainly my experience in Australasia and in the UK is that increasingly it's not possible to carry the title of professor and believe in God, and the two are mutually exclusive in that part of the world. It's the science. It's not that the sciences are the cause of the problem. It's the scientism that dominates the mode of thought of the administration of those institutions, who are dominated themselves by medical people or by chemists or by physicists, who themselves are focused on a way of being successful which is concerned with getting massive grants to do quasi-objective, value-free research, because there is a fundamental belief in the mindsets of the governments that science will solve all things. That's the problem. So I absolutely agree and support and value immensely those brave scientists and other academics in our universities, and they were mentioned earlier on, who do speak to the value-laden questions that underpin this scientism problem. But they do so against the wishes of the administrations of these universities, who are increasingly focused on generating income to cross-subsidize the science research so that they can compete with other universities in their own countries, and so that from the government point of view, the governments can compete, the countries can compete scientifically with other countries. So that's the real problem in that space, as I've experienced it personally, and it drives home even in the sense that one's research performance expectations as an academic are focused on the delivery of double-blind peer-reviewed publications in a select number of journals which are regarded by the system as valid. So the whole thing then becomes mutually reinforcing and degenerative. That is the real challenge that we have as academics in this time. The thought of moderns, it's John's phrase, the thought of moderns, and it's the moderns who dominate the university systems and structures. It's their way of thinking which is so enthralling to governments, is source of the problem in my experience. What I would just say, if I can pick up some of the points from your chapter, which do talk to this powerfully to me, you speak about the idea of freedom having to be something more than the absence of restraints on individual behavior. And I would simply say that the freedom we're searching for, the freedom that you're calling for, is an absence of, no, it's not an absence, it's a presence of appropriate value-laden restraints on individualistic behavior in universities. So I think I'll just pause there in that direct response, if that's okay. Yeah.
Sure.
Vern, would you like to respond back to Mark?
I don't disagree with anything you said.
No. I'm just trying to think how to get quickly to that point. Pope Francis says in the text of this document at least 12 times, everything is connected. Everything is connected. And I asked the question, what does it mean to have that kind of a refrain in a document like this? And my answer was, it simply means that if everything is connected, nothing exists all by itself, for itself, alone, but always in relationship. And if that's true, then all the significant relationships in which we exist have to have some element of justice in relation to them, or else there's going to be trouble and destruction and suffering, et cetera, et cetera. So, freedom has a positive content. How many of you heard Pope Francis's presentation to the U.S. Congress? How many of you heard that? Remember how he started out? He said, "It's great to be here in the land of the free and the home of the brave." And he got a large ovation and people stood up. And I think the audience that heard him say that probably was thinking about negative freedom. In other words, the absence of restraint on behavior. They were not probably thinking about the commitment to and the ability to respond to the situation that we're in. And so we need a movement towards positive freedom. Now that's something that's characteristic of the classical tradition. Both the Platonic and the Aristotelian parts of that have a view of freedom which has content in it. And so I end up my essay by saying, what does freedom require of us today in our situation where human power over reality has grown by leaps and bounds? What does it mean? And I say, well, it probably means something like what to Whiteheadians when they say world loyalty. World loyalty should be our inspiring motive, and we should be trying to figure out what we need to do in relation to that so that we make some progress towards the kind of ecological civilization that we're after. So that was what I was saying there at the end. It's another way of talking about how you ought to deal with technology, actually. But it's a very hard thing for people for typical Americans who are typically pragmatic and utilitarian in their attitudes towards things. It's a very hard thing for most Americans to think about and respond to. Usually you have to go around behind and talk to them about their family relationships, for example, or about this or that problem where it's very clear that certain things have to happen in your group, or else things are going to break down and fall apart in destruction. So it's very hard for us to make progress towards that kind of a goal, although history is doing it for us. Because the more we experience the complications of the environmental crisis, the more it's becoming clear that our relationship to all aspects of reality is something that we have to attend to, or else there's going to be death and destruction. So that's one of the cutting edges in this whole process that I think Pope Francis very nicely highlights for us and helps us make some progress on. Now, the question that I asked this morning was, is there a religious component to that kind of recognition and realization? So in Catholic moral theology, the classical virtues have to be added to by the religious virtues, the Christian virtues. And is the experience of worship in the Mass, or for Protestants or for others in other kinds of worship activities, is that kind of experience necessary to get us to transcend our situation and be able to respond to the situation we find ourselves in? That's the big question that I asked you the other night, and you can answer that if you want.
No, because I haven't worked an answer out to it yet, I don't think. Perhaps we could, let's throw it open to the floor.
Yes, we've got about 14 minutes. Any questions from the observers? Yes?
Bob Hurd, this is just riding on what you were just saying. I don't know if the question is, do we need the religious, theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity? Is it necessary? We already have these churches, communities in place. So the question is, how can, in that context, we help a formation for people to have insight into the issue and be able to get on board to organize to change it? So I'm sure Pope Francis would say, yes, we need grace, we need God to address these problems. But since we already have believers of various traditions who take God seriously, then I think the next step is, how do we do worship in such a way that these issues come to the fore and people can be brought into it?
I agree. In my experience, I've worked very closely with evangelical Protestants on the UW-Madison campus. And this spirit is alive in hundreds of people from that religious perspective on campus. And it's a very constructive kind of a thing. And there's a lot of hope in relation to it. I've also worked with a lot of people who have no discernible religious foundation or background at all whatsoever, but who practice their science in a way that I would call religious and deeply profound in that sort of a way. And there's a lot of unity between them, despite the fact that they can't talk about the resurrection, or they can't talk about all kinds of things that you might talk about from a more strictly religious background. So there's a lot of hope in those places where people are beginning to wake up to what's happening and what's needed. And it doesn't just depend on Roman Catholic worship or Protestant or Orthodox worship. And yet, in the Pope's encyclical, there's an implication that this is an important aspect.
I had a question for Mark. I taught for 35 years at the University of California, mostly in Riverside. And I was curious about your comments about your university. I think it's true at the University of California for sure that more and more and more and more emphasis has been placed on making money through the research that's done there. But part of that, I think, has to be that the budget was cut by the state of California, and less and less and less funds from the state were going in. That was the profit end. The other thing they're doing is charging the students a lot more, increasingly, and part of that is because they can, because of the student loans that they can get from the government, and these 18-year-olds are coming in and they don't know what it means to borrow $20,000 to go to school for a year. And so it all just feeds on itself. The departments that teach value things like philosophy and languages and arts and so on keep kind of getting knocked back a little bit because even though they're cheaper to teach, it's cheaper to teach. I taught English. It's cheaper to teach that than science because you don't need a lab. And I sure didn't get paid very much. But even so, they need the money for those money-making areas. And I wondered if it's happening there too. Is it a government thing in that way, that big?
Yeah. So first of all, I need to make a slight correction to the introduction to me. When I wrote the short bio, I'd sent it to John and left it at that. And then it came out, and suddenly I'd been made dean of my business. And I wrote John and I said, look, I'm not. Chris Hurley is the dean. And John wrote back and said, well, my goof, but you should be. Very, very good of him. I have been a head of a school. I was head of the School of Management at the University of Tasmania, and I've been a deputy chair of Academic Senate, as well as an associate dean of learning and teaching in a previous job as well. The challenge that faces universities in English-speaking countries, it's not so bad here, but there's a reason, and I'll come to the reason in a minute. But English-speaking countries, so here, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK in particular, is that for some reason, the electorates in those countries, as a result, I'm almost convinced of it, of only needing to speak English in order to be successful in the world, do not value education as a public good. They only see it as a private benefit. And so it is that no government in any of those countries would ever be electable if they funded higher education, especially in an era of massification of higher education, to the extent that all of the advisors in all of the government departments know that it needs to be funded, because the electorate would not elect them. Simple as that. And so in the face of that hard reality, for example, Australia at the moment is trying to increase fees because it knows that the only way it's ever going to sustain any sort of higher education is to put the burden on the person who is receiving the education, because of that general mindset that higher education in particular is a private benefit. Okay, so then you have a situation where parts of the university that are that teach courses that are easy to teach and cheap to teach. So arts courses, business courses are used to cross-subsidize, the fee income from there is used to cross-subsidize those parts of the universities where research is extremely expensive. And so most business schools, I can tell you this from experience of being 20 years in business schools, most business schools are expected to return between a 30 and 40% contribution margin to the center. And many business schools in this country, as well as in other English-speaking countries, are increasingly reliant on international student fees.
That's true.
And that's because they charge an arm and a leg as an international student, and they just simply take that money and put it into the sciences so that they can say to their governments, we are competitive as a science nation competing with other nations. So one of the most amazing things that I'm finding at the moment is that English-speaking, value-free research universities are wooing Chinese students in particular, but not only Chinese students. And I don't mean to say only Chinese students, but in particular Chinese students, requiring them to pay enormous amounts of money for an education in an English-speaking university so that that university and that country can be competitive against China in science research. That is a brass neck. And it's worse than that. Because we are putting the burden of higher education on our young people, we are denying them a future because we are saddling them with debts that they will never repay. And the Bernie Sanders, the flow of energy towards Bernie Sanders, the flow of energy towards Jeremy Corbyn in the UK with Labour, came about, I'm sure, as a result of the despair among the young people, the future of our countries, as to what their future could possibly be. So it's extremely complicated, but in essence, there is a fundamental problem with the disconnect between ourselves and nature, and ourselves and the values that should be driving science research, that we know as individual scientists in our hearts to be true, but that systemically do not. Okay, that's a long answer to a short question.
We've got time for one more question. John?
Yes, I have a question for Vern. This has to do with the fact that all of my graduate education was obtained at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And when I was a senior in college, I was offered a 2-year fellowship to go there, and I accepted it, and this was in physics. And I had no pressure, zero pressure on me to choose research in physics that was economically important, and I, in fact, did not choose anything that was money-making. But I only later learned that the money that supported me for those first 2 years came from the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. Is based on two things: the patent for putting vitamin D into milk and the development of warfarin, the rat poison that kills animals in opposition to Pope Francis's document. Now, my question to you is, should I feel guilty?
Well, I think that's up to you.
All right. Since you gave me a non-answer, I'm going to ask you another question and press you for an answer. And that is, when you were at Wisconsin, did anybody ever say anything about the great giant of ecology, Aldo Leopold?
All the time, all the time. He's famous in Wisconsin, and he's prominent in environmental and ecological ethics. And
I haven't heard his name in this conference.
he was mentioned earlier this
mentioned
morning.
him earlier. Who, John?
He was mentioned, sorry.
Yeah. So he's part of the great tradition which the university is largely failing to live up to, and which is part of the struggle at a place like the University of Wisconsin. So.
Thank you.
Okay, we need to shift to our other half of the hour. And so in this section, Mark will talk about his essay, and then Vern will respond, and then we'll have some discussion.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak about my essay. I decided to fly out here. You'll have gathered from what I said before that there's no way a research university would fund a trip like this because it's not producing a double-blind peer review article. But it's been so wonderful to be here, and I value these times here so much because I feel that I'm speaking with people who understand me and support me. I'd like to just say one other just slight point of adjustment to the introduction, which is that I just want to acknowledge Professor Bruce Hanson, who co-chaired the management track with me at the conference. We had some wonderful conversations, both together but also as a group in that track, and we realized, amongst other things, that the challenges and the problems of management were so enormous that we needed they would take a lifetime to solve, and that we should therefore start immediately. Now, why are these problems so significant? It's okay for economists to come up with wrong-minded theories about how the world should be. It's okay for scientists to however unintentionally, disconnect subject from object and just focus on objects. It's okay for them to separate out values and not really concern themselves with that in their day-to-day research. So long as nobody decides to take any notice of what they say, so long as nobody decides to try and implement their recommendations. The people who decide to implement those recommendations aren't the public policy analysts or the writers of public policy who build from those recommendations. They're the leaders and managers of the corporations and institutions that have the wherewithal to effect change. So when we think of all the great university topics, fields of inquiry, I'm not going to say disciplines, all of them are about either the value-free advance of knowledge or the value-laden advance of knowledge. They are about, as somebody said previously, being able to describe and refine in ever greater detail our knowledge of the universe in all its wondrous mystery. There's only one field of inquiry that possesses us with the capacity to change the world in the light of those new discoveries, and that is management. Management is the only means we have at our disposal to crucially intervene in and change the world. So it is therefore management that we should lay the blame for all of the problems that we face now. Oh, I'm serious. Management at the present time, and for the last probably 300 years in the modern era, has been concerned solely with the delivery of greater and greater economic profit, the delivery of higher and higher gross domestic product, greater and greater returns on investment for corporations and other businesses. And as soon as management is turned to that purpose, it is impossible for it to turn itself to any other purpose. And yet management, I contend, is a universal feature of all purposeful life. It's not the preserve of man. or woman. I don't mean to say, I don't mean to say that in any patriarchal sense. It's not the preserve of Homo sapiens. If you look at bees, all you need to do is observe a hive of bees, and you know the figure of 8 dance of a honeybee. That is an illustration of leadership, of leaderful behavior, pointing the way. If you look at a meerkat group, which is a matriarchal society, that is replete with leadership, with leaderful and managerial behavior. If you look at an ant colony, they engage in management practice. They adjust their environment to suit their needs to a point. They have places that they have chosen to gather food, and they have some form of carved out highway which they follow to go between where they live and where they eat, where animals procreate and where they eat, and there's a highway between them. Every single feature of purposeful life engages in some form, some even primitive form of management and organization. So it's not the preserve of Homo sapiens. But if, as I've said, that management is the problem and it's the cause of all the problems, we've got to ask ourselves, what is it about us that means we have screwed it up so much? What is it about our use of management? One word: money. We have turned creating shelter, building homes, into making money. We have turned gathering food and consuming food into making money. We've turned getting from A to B and back again into making money. Hell, we've even turned procreation into making money. Okay. Well, I can go on infinitum about the problems, and you know them all, but I want to say that if management is the only mechanism by which we have the capacity to intervene in and change the world, however much we've misused it, then there is the faintest possible hope that we can intervene in and change the world for the good, and the only way to do that is through management. But that management, the type of management I'm talking about, is radically different from the management as we've practiced it in the last 300 years at least. Has to be a management which is closer to the natural way of managing, which is closer to connectedness, relationality. And so I would like to suggest that if we are going to radically rethink management, it needs to be concerned not with enabling the exploitative extraction of value from the earth by man for the purpose of generating economic growth, which is what it is at the moment. It needs to become the graceful, and I use the word on purpose, the graceful reconciliation of man with the earth, enabling the enhancing integration of value for the earth for the purpose of generating the growth and well-being of all purposeful life. That is a radical change. And so, how long have I got? Not too long. What is it that we need to focus on in particular about management to get that change to happen? Bearing in mind that we concluded at the end of the conference that this was a lifetime's work and we should start immediately, we better focus in on a couple of things. One of the big problems that, and this is pertinent for the Laudato Si, it's pertinent for this conversation, that I argue in that chapter, is that man's understanding of power is completely wrong-minded. And that misunderstanding of power, David Corton has argued in his books, which I would recommend to you, in The Age of the Corporation, for example, comes from two completely wrong general beliefs about God. One he construes as being, or he summarizes as being, equivalent to an understanding of God as the distant patriarch, and the other he construes as a grand machine belief. That's right. And that manifests itself in management as what I've described as the mini-omni-God approach to management. I don't know, any of you who've worked in organizations probably experienced managers who behave as if they are mini-omni-gods. People who have taken a particular view that they've been brought up with, even imbibed unconsciously, the view of an omnipotent and omniscient God, and they hold that and they act in the organization as if they are all-knowing and all-powerful. And of course, you may know that if you have some form of power, you can gather knowledge around you. And so these sorts of managers hoover up knowledge from everybody that they can get it, but they never give knowledge out. They never give it back. Now, knowledge is power. If you have that sort of knowledge, you have the power to do what you want. And that power in an omni-God setup is usually destructive of people and well-being. And so the sort of power that we need to think about more carefully in regards to management is the sort of power that John speaks about in regards to Jesus' Abba, a much more compassionate approach to the role of management in organization. So that view of power, which I might ask John to talk to, if you don't mind, for 5 minutes, can really become what drives a managerial behavior for the future that can make sense of the problems we are facing, but crucially help us find a way through in such a way that we have a world which is beneficial for all purposeful life and is genuinely reconciliatory. So I might take a liberty and pass over to you. Can you talk for 5 minutes about that type of power?
I think I shouldn't spend 5 minutes, but I'll spend, I hope, 2 minutes.
Okay.
No, I'm glad. The process community has all along regarded the view of power that dominates our society as having misled us in very profound ways. And what's the power to control is deeply rooted, and the notion of divine omnipotence is almost always understood to be God controls everything, God determines everything. Now, it happens that the translation of the Bible in Latin is what introduced this idea. It's not in the original Hebrew. That's a side issue for our purposes, but I think a somewhat important one. The other view of power is the power to empower. And the power to control is really the power of killing. It is reducing the power of other people. And the ultimate reduction, of course, is death. And of course, it has always included killing people. I mean, that's the full expression. But if we think instead that real power, and I think almost all teachers would say, controlling the children, well, you have to exercise a little control just to get their attention, but controlling the children is not your job. What you want to do is to share understanding with them, give them more confidence in their own thinking, strengthen their ability to make their own decisions, become creative. So true power is the power to make other people powerful. There's a lot more we could say about it, but I think that's the most important part.
That's great. Thanks, John. Vern.
Well, I have a question for you. For true power to manifest itself, do we have to wait for the revolution? Or is it possible within our given circumstances, given what we know? And if it is possible, do you or Bruce have any examples of this emerging in our own context? And how has it gone for these projects that have manifested true power?
There is a concept in management known as servant leadership. It's the idea that a leader is servant to the people that they're supposed to be well, the people they're responsible for. And I hope that when I was a head of school, I operated as a servant leader, and I found that to be very, very valuable. And that was all about enabling people to grow and develop as human beings, and creating opportunities for them to do that in an environment in which they felt safe to play, safe to fail. Okay, you get a lot more out of people like that. And I found that worked really well until a new regime began to have its effect in the university, which started to put in place objective measures of performance. And then people started to focus their attention on survival. And then anything I said in that language of servant leadership, in that attempt to be compassionate, in that attempt to empower them to better themselves, that just was totally against everything that they could understand their relation to the organization to be. And so I actually found myself, and also my fellow managers in the organization, couldn't understand a word I was saying. I was just that, increasingly I became that idiot in the corner. That is an incredibly crushing experience. If you are a lone voice in that wilderness, you get snuffed out ever so fast. Now, of course, the irony is that when people have got the time and the space to reflect on what happened, then they will come back to you and say, you know, you were right. It's too late then. So there are really real problems if the organizational structures are about reinforcing traditional command and control issues. Now, you've spoken to me about Mondragon and Cummins, Diesel. Those are two organizations which have taken a very different perspective on things. I don't know much about them. I'm happy to turn over to you to speak to those two things, or if Bruce you want to come in at this stage and give some examples of organizations which are cooperative or spiritual in their way of thinking.
I think, the experience with, it's kind of seems to be emerging differently than that. It's, in some ways, the natural order of organizations now has become modularized. And there's a move so you get small cellular forms. And so what's kind of emerging is that the physical form is changing. That's due to change of technology. Basically created unit operations. A lot of things have broken down because people are much more powerful technologically. And so it has emerged in some of the it's being reflected in some of the texts too, that teams end up becoming central, but not the traditional team. It's an emergent network form. And so one of the things, so what happens with a lot of the socialized form is that it's, Nanaka talked about it as the knowledge creating organization is middle out. It's not top down, bottom up. The pyramid's pretty much destroyed. And, so it's middle out. And so in organizations, you take what authority you have and where you are, and that becomes the center of what you operate from. And so it gets beyond a paradox of empowerment is that oftentimes in the past, in the industrial period, you had to empower someone, which immediately would disempower them because you empowered them. So there's a tautology there that it was hard to get around in the industrial mindset. But in the kind of new reality of the piece, it emerges out from the place that we show up. Now, figuring out what to do from there is the bigger challenge, and how to get that orientation.
Bruce, you teach at a rather conservative Christian institution. Does that theological and religious commitment make any difference in any of this that we're talking about?
There's a lot of confusion because they're still operating under the old rules, and it really isn't working. But the illusion continues. So that's one of the great human sufferings that's created, is because many people, they realize that this is the world, this is how it works, this is how Google and how a lot of Snapchat and all this stuff emerges out of small places all around the world, and it pops up in Myanmar. Things are popping out. A lot of the different parts of the world are getting powerful, but they don't understand it so much. And so some of this has to be more self-consciously known. And so in my environment, they really don't understand it. They just kind of get angry, and I think that's where a lot of the political fallout right now is out of not understanding a world that's changing very rapidly.
Yeah. I'd like to, so Ignacio has a question?
Yeah, seems to me that your question was very interesting, and the response was even more interesting about the disconnect between what, in some ways, we know would work, but and I hear you the same thing in terms of the theories of management are available, but they're not implemented. I mean, much better theories of management than the way the universities or businesses are being managed and governed. In the U.S., what was it, about 30 years at least, or maybe 40, that McGregor was talking about the Y theory of management, and then Ouchi with his theory Z and all that. But very few organizations are run by those principles, and it seems like the university even less.
And that's because by and large it has been shown since those theories that look, theory X just works better. You get better, more effective, and or rather you get more effective results. People, if you put people under a certain amount of tension, a certain amount of pressure, they deliver for you. So theory X is just statistically shown to work, and therefore the drive, of course, you must remember in this day and age, profits are narrower and narrower and narrower. They're tighter and tighter and tighter. So every single cent you can save or earn is for large corporations in particular, big retail chains, is absolutely critical. They're not going to be fluffing around with anything that they can't be guaranteed is going to work. And I just want to pick up I agree. You and I teach entrepreneurship and innovation stuff, right? And it's really important to enable people to see that it's possible to make a living doing what you love. And it's true that in this world we live in now, there's a much emergent understanding. At the end of the day, though, if Google or if Apple, if any small micro business wants to fulfill its potential to grow, it ends up having to find funding from venture capitalists who want their return on their investment. And the challenge is, how do you retain all of that wondrous, beautiful humanness that allows those ideas to emerge, and yet deliver on the ROI? The Deputy Vice Chancellor Academic of a very, very successful Australian research university said to me once that they had recently divested from their portfolio of shares a whole bunch of petrochemical and other fossil fuel businesses, and the students were greatly happy at this. They thought this was a fabulous example of how their intervention had made a difference, and the university had seen the light and turned the corner. Simple fact of the matter was that those investments in fossil fuels weren't giving the university the return it wanted, so it changed its investments to others that would get a better return. There was no moral issue in the decision. So, Vern.
Well, maybe this is the last question. We do have an institution which theoretically has transcendence as part of its being in the world, and that's the church. So have you seen any examples? Have you seen any examples of creative leadership in the way that you're talking about it in the church, where there ought to be more sensitivity and more openness to this?
I haven't made a study of the church or the churches, but all I know is that whenever I take that precious opportunity to spend even half an hour in that library over there, sat on those chairs that are beautifully cut so you can actually kick back a little bit. Have you been in there? They just fantastic. I recommend it to you. Every chance I get to be in that library and I pick up books on church management, the advance in knowledge that was available 50 years ago in church management speaks volumes to me now. Mainstream management is nowhere near the thinking of the people who were looking at and thinking about how to manage human beings in the church, how to get the most out of them for themselves. So it's a real resource. And so I can't say anything except to say I'm deeply in awe of the thinking that has gone in church management, because it's vastly in advance of anything that's out there in the real world.
Mark, I just wanted to ask a question. In my own personal thinking, one of the reasons I think that Jesus attracted so many more followers than John the Baptist is because Jesus was a magnetic force drawing people to him through love, whereas John the Baptist was kind of, what we know of him at least, was more of a push force, telling people to repent. There's a guy that I did some work with in the Atlanta area who's a consultant, management consultant, uses the phrase pull thinking, and it's very, very process friendly, where he talks about that the most powerful forces in nature are all pull forces. And so he helps organizations, companies, align themselves around the pull of their customer. And I wonder too if there's not more that can be said there in terms of that lure, that it's not just about management being a servant leader, though that is what happens in that kind of setup, but about the lure of the purpose. And he would talk about that, a company makes money by the fact that a customer thanks you with payment because you've given them a product or service.
Yeah. So look, that argument is the argument my father used for 50 years as a self-employed businessman. He used to say, you cannot make money for yourself unless you make it for other people. That's fundamental. But that is the view that is how you pioneer products, is you pay attention to the needs of the customer. Your focus is entirely on the needs of the customer. And your role is to serve the customer and give the customer what they need, which might be different from what they want. So there's a good deal of education in that. But when organizations get to a certain stage, they start to focus not on the customer, but on themselves. They start to focus on sales targets, right? And the reps have to go out and they have to meet sales targets. They have to sell 10,000 widgets in 6 months or whatever it is. As soon as that switch occurs, then you get a circumstance where people no longer matter, where relationships no longer matter. My father has been retired 30 years. He's the same age as John, 91 this year, and he still gets phoned up by his former customers asking him for technical advice on the products he used to sell. He still gets. Now, that's because he was focused on them and relationships. When you get large corporations, they ain't interested in relationships. As Tim said, it gets very short term. It's the delivery of the profit today. Make the money now. I want you as my rep to deliver me a sales target, and you've got to hit it, otherwise you're gone. That's a very different view. I absolutely agree with your consultant friend, but it's extremely rare.
I just want to say, we haven't talked about workers at all in this organizational breakthrough. And what I'm seeing a lot of for people who live in San Francisco and get bused to Google on Google buses and whatever, is that it's like a gilded slavery, wagon. It may be a cushy bus, but it's a 15-hour job. There may be ping pong tables, but they're at work.
So where Apple was so successful very early on was focusing on creating an environment in which people were safe to play, safe to try ideas. Now it's a major corporation. It's having to deliver bottom line numbers. As soon as you have to deliver bottom line numbers, unfortunately, you're no longer dealing with human resources, you're only dealing with human remains. Human remains management is what it turns into. And so the workers are there. The workers are just they're just carbon unit robots. That's all they are. They're just another form of robot. And that's the real danger. So yeah, workers. What do we mean by workers? And how do we enable them to grow and feel connected to everything? How do we make sure they're able to not fall into the great cleft that major corporations force them to work in? Yes. I agree.
Well, we are out of time, so it is time for us to first give a hand to our presenters. And now we'll have a coffee break until 4:30, at which point you'll hear Bonnie and I doing some more singing. And we hope that you'll join us.
Yes, love it.